So if you've seen the multimedianinja.com website at all, or even the Twitter ads or Facebook page ads, for lack of a better word, you'll know that every week we have a little featured image. That's actually what WordPress calls it, that appears at the top of each blog or podcast post. And in addition to being a cool little just enhanced creative sketch to kind of do something creative every week in the vein of the graphic novel or comic book that kind of goes with the website and all, I think the tutorial of this, just a quick run through, will also not only give some info on some concepts in Photoshop and the application Paper Camera, which is heavily used in creating these, but also I think gives you a really good sense of how you need to be able to jump from one thing to another in various platforms as a multimedia ninja. And by the way, notice that the position and size of the logo, the branding, remains exactly the same in each of these things, which I use, like I say, in Twitter, on Facebook, etc. Got that idea from Mr. Gary Vaynerchuk to have the logo on these kind of assets. So let's get to it. Before we get started, I should just mention a couple of things. One is I'm probably going to need to break this tutorial into maybe 3 chunks just for your convenience in viewing it. Secondly, since I come from PC originally, and now I'm slightly confused when I talk about certain keystrokes, if I say Control, I am probably talking about the Command key on the Mac, which is the Apple key. And if I say Alt, I'm referring to the Option key on the Mac. If I say Control and this thing comes up, it is the actual Control key on the Mac, which is more like the Function key in PC or something like that. And finally, if I say Shift, you may see an up arrow looking thing, but that is the Shift icon and is different than the up arrow icon. Hope that clears things up. But anyway, if I say Control, I probably mean the Command key on the Mac. If I say Alt, I probably mean the Option key on the Mac. I'll try and stick with the Mac equivalents or give both of them, but just FYI. First, what we're going to do is we want to do this little thing. It looks like some kind of wino, but he's drinking Pro Tools and Photoshop, etc. So we're going to go into Photo Booth on the Mac in this case, which is just a basic thing that comes with it. And we're going to take a picture. Bajink, that was the picture we took. Just want to note, first of all, of course, if you're on PC, you're not going to have this Photo Booth application. You may have something similar. But since we're on Mac, I want to go ahead and drag the picture I just took in Photo Booth onto the desktop. Because if you go into Photoshop and try and place an image from Photo Booth into Photoshop, you can have some issues. So by just dragging it onto the desktop, we'll be able to locate it in the Finder. So then we're going to open up Photoshop. So we're going to come in Photoshop and say File, New, and it's not going to be grayscale actually. It's set up to be a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is what I use for the headers for the featured images, and it happens to be the width of my monitor, 2560, and I find that gives me a good resolution to work from, where I can do the header in that size and then let it downsize for the web. So I do that. We place the image that we took from Photo Booth, and we say 200%. And we see that we're going to be sticking out the bottom of the frame. We're kind of sticking out the top here, and that's not going to be good. So I'm going to discard that. And then I took another shot in Photo Booth, and we're going to place that one. And we find that's going to work a lot better. But what I'm actually going to do is maximize our real estate here, something like that. And we'll be having our logo up here, so I'll hit OK. So we have our source photo. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is fill up the flask or the decanter with some kind of liquid looking thing. And to do that, I'm going to paint on a new layer. So I just go down to the bottom of the layers panel here and click on new layer. And you can see that that adds a blank layer that we can paint into. And then I'm going to go over on the tool panel on the left and grab the paintbrush tool. And I'm just going to paint in the bottom of the decanter here with a burgundy colored paint fill. And I've set the opacity on the paintbrush to about 60%. And obviously that doesn't look like much. So we're going to go over to the layers panel and we're going to change the blending mode. We have a lot of these different blending modes and I often use overlay. And that didn't quite give me the effect I wanted, but you can see it changed how the layer behaves. And we can try some other options. I just tend to experiment and see what works best. Exclusion is usually pretty weird. And I just ended up settling on color dodge for this layer, and you can see the effect that that makes. Okay, now I'm going to just duplicate this layer and use a different blending mode on the duplicate layer, and this is admittedly in the throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks sort of methodology, but that's okay. And I normally don't want to burden you in this tutorial with a lot of keystroke commands, but there is a very important one you should be aware of. That is Command J on the Mac or Control J on the PC. And what it does is to duplicate either the entire layer by default, or it will duplicate any part of the layer that is selected. And so you just hit Command J, and that, as you can see, creates a duplicate layer, the exact same thing. And so we're going to go back into the blending modes in the layers panel, and on this new layer we are going to choose overlay, and you see it makes this cool little scientific potion look when you blend these two layers onto the background. It looks like something you probably would not want to drink. So now the red studio background would probably be okay for what we're trying to do, but I'd rather get like some kind of urban brick wall behind there. So we're going to go over to the tools palette and grab the quick selection tool, which is in the same place as the magic wand tool. And the quick selection tool basically just intelligently selects parts of your image. And with most tools, the right bracket will make it bigger and the left bracket will make it smaller. So we're just getting an appropriate size to use the tool, and you just drag it around the image and you can see that it does a really good job of finding which areas to select. We're going over on the right, under the flask, under the decanter, up here, and I'll make the tool a little smaller to get in certain areas. Now notice if you've over-masked something like we have on the bottle, then you can hit the Alt key and the cursor will have a little minus on it. And it might be hard to see, but then you can undo, you can kind of reselect parts that were selected out there. So I'm just going around the picture and I am using a combination of the normal quick selection tool, and you see here we've over-selected part of the decanter. So I use the Alt tool to fix some of those, and then you come back on the outside with the regular tool, and it kind of learns as you go. It refines the selection. Here's a little piece of the white trim that was not selected out. So we're basically just selecting what we want to mask out of the background. Now notice that although we were selecting the background, I was actually on the top layer, and we need to be selecting the back layer, which you can do and still maintain your selection. And then we're going to create a layer mask that hides the selection. Simple enough. Bam. There you go. And then you'll notice that over in the layers panel, the background layer now has a little black and white mask attached to it, which determines which parts of that layer show and which parts don't. By clicking on either this layer mask or the layer icon, you can select which one of these two things you want to operate on. If you option click the layer mask, you will bring that up in the main window where you can see it and directly work with it. By option clicking again, we go back to viewing the actual layer contents, but notice here that the layer mask in the layers panel here is actually what is still selected. So what we're going to do is actually leave that selected, and we're going to use the brush tool using black and white, and you could also use gray values to be semi-transparent, but we're basically going to be using the brush tool to refine the layer mask and to just correct some little flaws that we didn't quite catch when we were using the quick selection tool. So now with black set as my foreground or active color, I'm going to select the paintbrush tool. And I'm going to go up here to the options and set the opacity a little bit lower, maybe about 70%. And then, actually, let's just zoom in here a little bit. Oh dear. How about we zoom out a little bit with Command minus. And we'll just drag this out of here. And we'll grab the paintbrush tool again. And what we're going to do is just basically we're going to paint on that mask because the mask is still active. We're painting on it with a black 70% opacity color. And you see the result is we're sort of masking out additional bits of this layer. Let's just look around and see if there's anything else. Yeah, kind of work on the beard a little bit there. And you see, since the mask is still active, we are actually just going to be painting out parts of the mask, the layer mask, so that we are, some of the bottle here is kind of needed some tweaking. The bottom of the bottle will kind of clean up. We don't have to go crazy with it because we're just going to turn it into a cartoon later. So you may have noticed one potential problem here in that the red studio wall is showing through the top of this decanter or flask. And if we put a background behind this, it should show through what is supposed to be a glass container. So I'm going to do this just a hair differently than you may see in the text tutorial on the blog post, just with respect to one step, and that is I'm going to, and you notice that we are still selecting the mask of this layer itself, not the image, but the mask, which tells us what information in this layer will be displayed, which is white in the mask, and which part is not displayed, which is black in the mask here, as you can see. But I'm going to actually make part of it gray. So I'm going to come and change the foreground color to a medium sort of gray. Hit OK. And then with the mask still selected, I'm going to paint a little bit of gray in the top of this flask here, this decanter. And that's going to make this a little more transparent. Now you see it still has a little hint of red, and we will deal with that using the sponge tool, which basically sponges out color information from the layer. Now, when I click on the layer here, the image itself, it was imported as what is called a smart object. So you notice if I come over here, I get the little no can do icon. So what we have to do is change this smart object into an editable image, which is called rasterizing it. We're going to go layer, rasterize, and we're just going to say rasterize the smart object. If you say rasterize the whole layer, it's going to go ahead and combine the layer mask into the image and get rid of the layer mask, and we still want the layer mask. So I'm going to just say smart object, and you'll see that the little icon goes away from the layer thumbnail over here on the image part, and we now have an editable image that we can sponge. And I'm going to get the sponge thing here, the sponge tool, and I'm going to set it, yes, 77% is probably fine. And I'm going to just sponge out some of the color information. You can see it's getting a little more grayscale, very subtle at the moment, since I don't have it set at 100%. So now we've got more of a gray top of the decanter here that's good enough that will hopefully let the background image show through and look more realistic. Okay, so now that we have Crazy Drinking Man here with the background cut out or masked out, actually, we're going to add an interesting background with the file place, our old friend. I'm going to pick an image that I've already selected by the way, which appears to be not copyrighted on Google. You want to be careful what you're using for source images. You can either try and find a not copyrighted image on Wikipedia, Wikicommons, etc., or you can go to a royalty-free sort of thing like iStockPhoto and get one. But this is from Wikicommons. So I'm going to place it here. By the way, holding down the Shift key while you drag keeps the image constrained so that it doesn't resize more horizontally than vertically, etc. And so it keeps your basic aspect ratio there. I'm going to pull it up to where we have a little bit of sidewalk showing. And I'm going to say, OK. And of course, we want it behind me, so I'm going to drag it in the Layers panel to the background, and there we go. Pretty good start. Now I want to add a couple of filters to this, and for some reason, I'm not sure why, I need to go ahead and rasterize this layer. Since there's no mask, I can either say rasterize the smart object, which is how the background image itself came in, or rasterize the whole layer where there's no mask. It's going to be the same effect, but do not say all layers. I'll just say smart object, and you'll notice that the little smart object icon now has gone away from that. And so this is pretty good, but I'm going to want to now say convert for smart filters, which, trust me, wasn't an option a second ago, despite the fact it's now going to tell me it's going to turn it back into exactly what it was before, a smart object. Whatevs. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, it lets us actually apply filters where they're not baked in. You can turn them on and off and that sort of thing. And the first filter I'm going to do, I'm actually going to use lens correction, but I'm going to come over here in custom, and we're actually going to make it lens distortion. You see, we're going to make it almost like a wraparound kind of effect for a little more drama. How about that? And then the other thing is, if you go back to themultimedianinja.com /9 and /10, those two episodes, we were talking about some film-like effects for video in that case, but part of the thing we were talking about is if you have a camera with a nice low f-stop, a wide aperture setting, you will get some blurring of the background, which is often desirable in photography and videography. In this case, we're going to simulate it with some blur, and I'm going to say Gaussian blur, and about 4.9 pixels looks pretty fine to me. I'm going to say OK. You'll notice over here that these effects can now be turned on and off independently of each other. And we're pretty much ready to save this and export it as a JPEG, which we will do now. Since it's just going to be changed into a cartoon effect, we'll use Save for Web, and we'll just leave it at the same maximum resolution and highest quality, but it will save space. We're going to save it in our Google Drive folder, the Podcast Featured Images folder, so that we can bounce it between devices. I'm going to call it TMN021 prepaper.jpg. And I'm saving this to my Google Drive, you see, so that I can then pick it up right out of there from my mobile device. I'm just going to hit save. We now have this image exported as a JPEG into Google Drive to import into Paper Camera on our mobile device.